The loudest sound inside the primate house that morning wasn't a roar, a crashing gate, or a blaring alarm. It was silence. Koba, the largest silverback at Ashwood Wildlife Park, stopped exactly 3 feet from the entrance to his indoor enclosure and refused to take another step. He didn't charge. He didn't pound his chest. He didn't threaten anyone. He simply stood there, staring into the dim opening as though something invisible had claimed the room beyond it. Visitors gathered behind the safety railing, whispering as children pointed toward the motionless gorilla. To them, it looked like stubbornness. To Nathan Brooks, the senior keeper who had worked beside Koba for nearly 11 years, it looked completely wrong. Every evening followed the same routine. Nathan gave a short whistle. Koba acknowledged him with a calm glance, and within seconds the massive gorilla walked inside without hesitation. Rain or sunshine, holidays or busy weekends, Koba had never broken that routine. Not once. But today, the familiar rhythm had vanished. Nathan tried the whistle again. Koba didn't move. He picked up Koba's favorite enrichment barrel and rolled it toward the doorway. The silverback ignored it. He even brought out a basket of fresh apples and leafy greens, something that usually earned immediate attention. Koba never looked down. His dark eyes remained locked on the darkness inside the enclosure, his breathing slow, almost measured, as though he was waiting for something no one else could hear. Other staff members exchanged uneasy looks. One ranger quietly suggested closing the outdoor habitat early. Another wondered if Koba was feeling sick. A veterinarian was called over the radio, just in case. Nathan listened to every suggestion, but none of them explained what he was seeing. Koba wasn't acting frightened. He wasn't acting aggressive. He looked determined. Every few seconds, he shifted his weight, took half a step toward the doorway, then stopped again. It was as if an invisible line had been drawn across the concrete, one that even an animal weighing nearly 450 pounds refused to cross. The crowd grew restless. Phones were raised. Someone joked that the gorilla was protesting bedtime. Nathan didn't laugh. He had learned years ago that when Koba abandoned his normal behavior, there was always a reason, even if humans failed to understand it at first. Then something happened that made Nathan's pulse quicken. Koba slowly lifted one massive arm, not toward the people watching, not toward the food waiting beside the gate, but toward the roofline above the enclosure entrance. His fingers remained perfectly still, almost as if he were pointing. Nathan followed the direction instinctively, squinting into the shadows beneath the steel beams, but from where he stood, he couldn't make out anything unusual. "Stay right here," he quietly told the other keepers as he reached for a flashlight hanging from the service cart. Koba immediately took one step sideways and blocked the doorway again without showing a hint of aggression, his eyes never leaving the darkness inside. Nathan had never seen him do that before. As the flashlight clicked on and its narrow beam reached the edge of the enclosure, Nathan saw something that drained every bit of color from his face. Koba never took his eyes off the entrance, even after Nathan slowly lowered the flashlight. The enormous silverback seemed less like an animal refusing an order and more like someone carrying a burden he could not explain. Nathan had spent more than a decade learning Koba's habits, and one lesson had never failed him. Fear made gorillas retreat. Anger made them display their strength. Curiosity made them move closer. But this was different. Koba remained planted in the same spot with quiet determination, his broad shoulders rising and falling in slow, controlled breaths. There was no panic in him, only an unwavering certainty that crossing that threshold was the wrong choice. The visitors could not see the difference, but Nathan could. He remembered the young gorilla that had arrived at the park years earlier after losing the family group that had raised him. It had taken months before Koba accepted a simple meal from a human hand, and even longer before he trusted anyone enough to rest peacefully while they worked nearby. Trust had never come easily to him. Every routine, every familiar voice, every predictable evening had become part of the small world that made him feel secure again. That was why today's silence felt heavier than any outburst ever could. Koba was not rejecting the enclosure itself. He was rejecting something hidden inside the life he knew. Nathan carefully stepped back instead of moving closer. He wanted Koba to understand that nobody was forcing him. The silverback glanced toward Nathan for only a second, and in that brief look, there was something Nathan had rarely seen before. It was not fear for himself. It was concern directed outward, almost as if Koba was silently asking his old friend not to make a terrible mistake. The other keepers continued discussing possible explanations. Maybe the lighting had changed. Maybe construction noise from another exhibit had unsettled him. Maybe he had sensed a strange smell drifting through the ventilation system. Each suggestion sounded reasonable until they looked back at Koba. He dismissed every distraction. He ignored every sound around him except whatever held his attention beyond the doorway. Even the younger gorillas inside neighboring habitats became unusually quiet, watching him without their usual playful behavior. The calm that settled across the primate building felt unnatural, as though every animal had noticed something people had overlooked. Nathan rested one hand against the safety railing and quietly spoke Koba's name again. This time the silverback answered with a soft rumbling sound deep in his chest, one Nathan had heard only during moments of reassurance. It was the same gentle vibration Koba made when an anxious juvenile needed comfort or when a trusted keeper sat nearby during routine health checks. Hearing that sound now only deepened the mystery. If Koba believed everything was safe, why would he refuse to move? If he believed danger was near, why was he trying so hard to keep everyone calm? Nathan's thoughts circled endlessly until his attention drifted upward once more. High above the enclosure entrance, almost hidden among the steel framework, a single dusty feather floated slowly to the floor even though there was no breeze inside the building, and Koba's eyes followed it all the way down without blinking. Koba's attention never drifted from the entrance, but his behavior began changing in ways Nathan had never witnessed before. Instead of standing perfectly still, the silverback started tracing the exact same path across the concrete in a slow, deliberate pattern. He took 4 measured steps toward the enclosure, stopped inches from the doorway, pivoted to his left, circled once, returned to the identical spot where he had begun, and repeated the sequence with astonishing precision. It was not nervous pacing. Every movement matched the previous one so closely that it looked almost rehearsed. Nathan silently counted. 4 steps. Turn. Circle. Return. Again. And again. Even the veterinarian paused midway through preparing a sedative, unable to ignore the strange routine unfolding before them. The visitors had grown unusually quiet now. The jokes had disappeared, replaced by uncertain whispers. Some believed Koba was becoming unpredictable. Others wondered if the gorilla was showing signs of an unseen illness. Nathan refused to jump to either conclusion, but every minute that passed tightened the knot in his stomach. Koba suddenly interrupted the pattern and crouched low, pressing one ear close to the concrete. He remained frozen for several seconds before lifting his head again. Then he repeated the same motion at another spot just outside the doorway, almost as if he were comparing 2 sounds that nobody else could hear. Nathan exchanged confused glances with the maintenance supervisor, who admitted there had been no repair work inside the primate building for several weeks. Nothing beneath the floor should have been making any unusual noise. Yet Koba continued his strange inspection with complete concentration. Without warning, he stood upright and carefully gathered a handful of dry leaves that the afternoon breeze had carried into the outdoor habitat. Rather than tossing them aside as enrichment toys often inspired him to do, he gently released them one by one toward the enclosure entrance. Each leaf drifted through the air, but before reaching the doorway they all changed direction, slightly, curling upward for an instant before settling on the ground. Nathan noticed it immediately. The movement was subtle, almost impossible to see unless someone was watching closely, but Koba reacted every single time as though he expected it. The silverback repeated the experiment several more times, collecting different leaves and letting them fall from different angles. Each result appeared to confirm whatever conclusion had already formed in his mind. The other keepers saw only unusual behavior. Nathan saw purpose, yet he still could not understand it. The park director arrived after receiving reports that the exhibit schedule had been interrupted. He observed Koba for less than a minute before quietly suggesting that the animal might be experiencing dangerous stress and should be secured by whatever method proved necessary. Nathan hesitated. Everything inside him resisted that decision. Koba had earned years of trust, and nothing about today's actions felt random. They felt intentional. As the discussion grew more urgent behind him, Koba suddenly abandoned the careful pacing altogether. He walked directly to the heavy service cart standing near the gate, wrapped both hands around one of its large rubber wheels, and with remarkable gentleness rolled the entire cart several feet until it completely blocked the entrance to the enclosure. Then he sat beside it, folded his arms across his chest, and refused to let anyone move it. The moment Koba settled beside the service cart, the atmosphere shifted from confusion to procedure. The park director quietly instructed the operations team to begin clearing the building completely, explaining that a gorilla who deliberately interfered with staff equipment could no longer be treated as predictable until specialists evaluated him. Nathan tried to object, reminding everyone that Koba had never harmed a keeper, never ignored commands without a reason, and had spent years proving he could be trusted. His words were met with polite silence rather than agreement. The concern was no longer about Koba's history. It was about what he might do next if the situation continued to escalate. A safety coordinator arrived, carrying a printed emergency checklist, and began reading each step aloud. Restrict visitor access. Prepare the isolation habitat. Assemble the veterinary response team. Nathan listened with growing frustration because every instruction assumed one thing from the very beginning. They assumed Koba had become the problem. Nobody stopped to ask why the silverback had been trying so hard to keep everyone away from that doorway. Instead, every unusual action was interpreted as evidence that something inside him had changed. The maintenance supervisor even suggested that age might have affected Koba's judgment, pointing out that older silverbacks sometimes developed unexpected behavioral shifts. Nathan looked back at Koba, who remained seated exactly where he had positioned the cart. The gorilla did not challenge anyone approaching from a distance. He did not make threatening displays. Whenever a keeper took a cautious step toward the entrance, however, Koba quietly slid the cart back into place if someone tried to move it. He never rushed. He never panicked. He simply restored the barrier with patient determination, as though protecting something that mattered far more than his own comfort. Unfortunately, that calm persistence only reinforced the staff's misunderstanding. To several employees, Koba now appeared possessive, unwilling to surrender control of the area. One young keeper whispered that perhaps the gorilla had become territorial overnight. Another wondered if he had hidden food or an object inside the enclosure and was refusing to let anyone retrieve it. Nathan knew neither explanation fit the animal he had cared for over so many years, yet he had no evidence strong enough to convince the others. Every minute without answers weakened his position. Even the visitors who had admired Koba moments earlier were beginning to leave with worried expressions, murmuring that something must be seriously wrong with the famous silverback. Nathan felt a quiet ache as he watched those reactions spread through the building. Koba had spent years inspiring curiosity and respect, but in less than an hour fear had replaced both. The gorilla looked toward Nathan again, his expression unchanged, almost pleading without making a sound. Nathan instinctively took one careful step forward, hoping to reassure him, but before he could speak, two veterinary technicians rolled a secure equipment case into the habitat. They moved professionally, calmly, and without anger, yet the sight of that case made Nathan's heart sink. It meant the discussion was over. The director signed the authorization form, handed it back to the lead veterinarian, and quietly said that if Koba still refused to allow access to the enclosure within the next few minutes, they would proceed with remote sedation so the area could be secured before the park reopened. Koba remained beside the service cart while the veterinary team quietly prepared their equipment, but Nathan could no longer ignore the uneasy feeling building in the back of his mind. The silverback had not once reacted to the people surrounding him. Instead, every action seemed tied to one specific place. As the lead veterinarian reviewed the sedation plan, Nathan glanced toward the concrete entrance again and noticed a maintenance clipboard lying on a nearby workbench. It contained the weekly inspection records for the primate building. Without interrupting anyone, he flipped through the pages, hoping to find anything that might explain Koba's behavior. Most entries were routine until one handwritten note from the previous evening caught his attention. A technician had reported hearing a brief metallic vibration above the indoor enclosure shortly after closing time. The note described it as isolated and likely caused by normal temperature changes in the steel framework. Because no visible damage had been found during a quick visual inspection from ground level, the issue had been marked for rechecking during the next scheduled maintenance window several days later. Nathan looked back toward the enclosure entrance. Suddenly, Koba's strange pattern from earlier no longer seemed meaningless. The careful pacing, the repeated pauses, the leaves drifting through the doorway, even the way he had blocked the entrance instead of running away from it. None of those actions resembled panic. They resembled observation. Nathan folded the clipboard shut and slowly walked to the maintenance supervisor. Keeping his voice low, he asked whether anyone had actually inspected the overhead support structure that morning. The supervisor hesitated before admitting that no one had. The building had opened on schedule because the previous report had not been considered urgent. They had only checked what could be seen from the main service corridor without bringing and lifting equipment. Nathan thanked him but said nothing else. His thoughts were interrupted by an unexpected sound. A tiny metal identification tag hanging from the service cart began to rotate gently against its chain. No one was touching the cart. There was no noticeable breeze inside the enclosed habitat, yet the tag slowly turned twice before becoming still again. Nathan instinctively looked toward the loose feather resting on the concrete exactly where it had landed earlier. It had shifted several inches across the floor without anyone noticing. The movement was almost impossible to detect unless someone had been staring at it. Koba immediately adjusted his position, nudging the service cart a few more inches until it covered the entrance completely again. The silverback did not appear frightened after making the adjustment. In fact, he relaxed slightly, as though whatever invisible condition he had been monitoring had changed only for a moment before returning. Nathan's pulse quickened. The pieces still did not fit together, but they no longer pointed toward a behavioral problem. They pointed toward something in the environment that only Koba had recognized. As the veterinarian quietly lifted the tranquilizer projector into position, Nathan raised one hand and asked for 60 more seconds. Before anyone could object, he picked up a powerful inspection flashlight from the maintenance station, requested the longest extension ladder stored in the service bay, and announced that he wanted to examine the upper framework above the enclosure entrance himself before anyone made a decision they could not easily undo. Koba did not interfere as Nathan carried the extension ladder toward the entrance. For the first time that morning, the silverback slowly stepped away from the service cart, not because he had changed his mind, but because Nathan was moving in a direction Koba had been trying to draw everyone's attention toward all along. The enormous gorilla remained only a few feet away, watching every movement with intense concentration. Nathan positioned the ladder beneath the overhead framework and climbed carefully until the flashlight beam reached the upper support assembly hidden above the decorative ceiling panels. At first, everything appeared ordinary. Thick steel members crossed above the enclosure exactly as the construction drawings described. Then the beam reflected off something that should not have been there. Wedged between two structural braces was a broken locking pin that had worked almost completely free from its housing. The pin had not snapped in a dramatic way. Instead, years of tiny vibrations had slowly pushed it outward until only a fraction of an inch still held it in place. Nathan froze. The locking pin secured one side of the heavy overhead transfer gate used during maintenance operations. If it slipped completely free while the gate was under load, the entire mechanism could shift unexpectedly. The danger was not obvious from the ground because every visible component still looked perfectly aligned. Nathan directed the flashlight farther into the framework and immediately noticed faint polished scrape marks that had not existed during the previous month's inspection. Something inside the mechanism had been moving little by little. He called for the maintenance supervisor, who climbed halfway up the ladder carrying a portable inspection mirror. After only a few seconds, the supervisor's expression changed completely. He quietly instructed everyone below to step away from the entrance immediately. The veterinarian lowered the tranquilizer projector without saying a word. The park director stared upward in disbelief as the supervisor explained that opening or closing the transfer system under normal operating force could have allowed the loose assembly to shift even farther. Nobody could predict exactly how the mechanism would react once it moved. Suddenly, every strange action from the morning fit together with startling clarity. Koba had never been refusing to enter his enclosure. He had been refusing to pass beneath the unstable structure. The repeated pacing had allowed him to sense subtle changes that humans could neither hear nor feel. The drifting leaves had been his own quiet test of the unusual air movement created by the slight separation inside the overhead housing. The service cart had not been an act of defiance. It had been a barrier placed exactly where he believed no one should walk. Even the gentle rumbling sounds had not been warnings of aggression. They had been attempts to keep Nathan calm while preventing him from approaching the entrance. Nathan slowly climbed back down the ladder, his hands trembling more than they had at any point that day. As his boots touched the concrete floor, Koba looked at him with the same patient expression he had worn since the morning began. There was no excitement, no triumph, and no sign of relief that humans had finally understood. The silverback simply waited, as though he had trusted all along that someone would eventually listen. Nathan removed his cap, looked across the short distance separating them, and realized with a heavy silence settling over the entire building that the one creature everyone believed needed to be controlled had spent the entire day protecting every person standing there. Koba remained exactly where he was, his broad frame relaxed at last, while the humans around him struggled to process what they had nearly done. The busy voices that had filled the primate building only minutes earlier faded into an uneasy silence. Nobody hurried to move equipment. Nobody reached for the tranquilizer case again. Instead, every pair of eyes slowly turned back toward the silverback with a completely different understanding. Nathan stood motionless, replaying every moment from that morning in his mind. The careful pacing that had seemed strange. The leaves Koba had dropped one by one. The service cart he had rolled into place with remarkable gentleness. The quiet rumbling sounds Nathan had mistaken for anxious behavior. None of those actions had been random. They had been patient attempts to communicate with people who never realized they were being warned. Nathan felt the weight of that realization settle heavily on his shoulders. He had always believed he understood Koba better than anyone else. Yet even he had nearly allowed fear and procedure to drown out years of trust. The park director slowly removed the emergency authorization sheet from his clipboard, folded it in half, and slipped it into his pocket without saying a word. The veterinarian quietly returned the tranquilizer equipment to its protective case, pausing for a long moment before closing the lid. One of the younger keepers looked toward Koba with visible embarrassment as memories flooded back of the comments suggesting the silverback had become unstable or territorial. Those words now felt painfully unfair. The maintenance supervisor broke the silence first. He admitted that if Nathan had not insisted on one final inspection, the unstable transfer mechanism might have remained hidden until routine operations resumed. Nobody answered him because there was nothing left to argue. The evidence was hanging above them, and the one individual who had recognized the danger hours earlier had never spoken a single human word. Nathan slowly walked toward the safety barrier separating him from Koba. He did not call out commands. He did not carry food or enrichment toys. For the first time all day, he simply stopped a respectful distance away. Koba looked at him calmly before extending one massive hand through the protected opening where keepers occasionally offered enrichment items during training sessions. Nathan hesitated only briefly before placing his own hand gently against the reinforced mesh opposite Koba's. The silverback rested his fingertips against the barrier without pushing or grabbing, holding them there for several quiet seconds. It was not a performance for visitors. It was not a trained behavior. It felt like a simple acknowledgement between two old companions who had finally understood one another again. Several staff members turned away, not because they wished to leave, but because the quiet honesty of the moment was more powerful than anyone expected. Nathan swallowed hard, realizing that trust had not been broken by Koba refusing the enclosure. It had nearly been broken by the humans refusing to listen. He looked toward the maintenance crew and calmly instructed them that the entire overhead system would remain closed until every component had been fully inspected, replaced where necessary, and independently certified safe. Then he made one more decision. Until that work was complete, Koba would not be pressured to return inside, because after everything that had happened, Nathan believed the silverback had earned something far more valuable than obedience. He had earned the right to be trusted in return. The following morning, Ashwood Wildlife Park looked different in ways visitors could not immediately explain. Bright orange safety barriers surrounded the indoor enclosure, while engineers carefully dismantled the damaged transfer mechanism piece by piece instead of rushing to repair only the broken section. Nathan insisted that every support, every locking pin, and every hidden connection be examined from top to bottom. explaining that if one overlooked detail had nearly cost them their trust, then nothing inside the habitat should be accepted without certainty again. The maintenance crews worked patiently for hours, documenting every finding while structural specialists verified each replacement before it was installed. Instead of moving Koba into another unfamiliar holding area, the staff redesigned their daily routine around him. Temporary enrichment stations were placed throughout the outdoor habitat so he could remain comfortable while the work continued. Fresh climbing structures, puzzle feeders, and shaded resting areas appeared over the next several days, not because Koba demanded special treatment, but because everyone finally understood that his sense of security mattered just as much as the schedule printed on the park calendar. Nathan also changed something far less visible. During every morning briefing, he asked each keeper to spend a few minutes sharing any unusual animal behavior they had noticed, no matter how insignificant it seemed. Nobody laughed at small observations anymore. A feather drifting strangely, an unexpected pause before entering a habitat, a repeated movement that seemed impossible to explain. Every detail was written down because Koba had quietly taught the entire team that animals sometimes recognized patterns long before people understood them. Visitors eventually returned to the primate building, but they were greeted by a new educational display describing how careful observation and mutual trust had helped prevent a serious mechanical failure. The exhibit never portrayed Koba as a performer or a miracle. Instead, it honored him as an intelligent individual whose behavior deserved respect rather than immediate judgment. Nathan noticed something else changing as the days passed. Koba no longer watched the entrance with the same heavy concentration that had filled every moment of that unforgettable morning. Instead, he resumed exploring the habitat with quiet confidence, occasionally stopping to inspect new enrichment items before calmly moving on. Still, Nathan refused to hurry the final step. Even after engineers declared the repaired enclosure completely safe, he left the connecting gate open and allowed Koba to make the choice himself. There were no whistles, no commands, no treats waiting inside. The decision belonged entirely to the silverback. The entire keeper team stood several yards back, giving him space. Koba approached the entrance slowly, paused beneath the newly reinforced framework, and rested one hand against the concrete floor for a brief moment, almost as though confirming that everything beneath and above him finally felt right. He remained there in thoughtful silence before lifting his head and continuing forward with calm, steady steps. He crossed the threshold without hesitation, explored the enclosure at his own pace, and then settled comfortably near the large viewing window where warm afternoon sunlight stretched across the floor. Nathan quietly smiled from outside the habitat, saying nothing at all. There was nothing left that needed to be explained. For the first time since that extraordinary morning, Koba closed his eyes for a peaceful afternoon rest inside the enclosure, not because someone had persuaded him to trust the place again, but because at last he knew the people around him had learned to trust him first. Weeks passed, and life at Ashwood Wildlife Park gradually returned to its familiar rhythm, but something quiet had changed forever. The repaired enclosure became one of the safest structures in the entire facility, not because of stricter engineering standards alone, but because every inspection now began with the same simple question: what have the animals been trying to tell us? Nathan kept the old maintenance clipboard instead of throwing it away. The faded note about the metallic vibration remained tucked inside its cover, reminding him how close everyone had come to dismissing the only warning that truly mattered. New keepers who joined the park eventually heard the story, not as a legend meant to entertain visitors, but as part of their first week of training. They learned that observation was not only about checking feeding schedules, medical charts, or security gates. It was also about respecting behavior that did not immediately make sense. Koba never became a public attraction because of what had happened. Nathan refused every suggestion to turn the event into a promotional exhibit or scheduled demonstration. He believed the silverback had not performed an extraordinary trick. He had simply done what trust and instinct had asked him to do. Instead, the educational display outside the primate building ended with a single photograph taken several days after the repairs were complete. In the picture, Koba was sitting peacefully beneath the morning sunlight, while Nathan worked quietly nearby with a maintenance checklist in his hands. Neither one was looking at the other. Yet anyone who paused long enough could feel the invisible understanding that existed between them. Visitors often stood in front of that photograph longer than they expected. Parents found themselves explaining to their children that listening sometimes meant watching carefully instead of waiting for words. Engineers who toured the park occasionally smiled when they learned that a structural inspection protocol had been improved, because one observant gorilla noticed something people overlooked. Nathan himself developed one lasting habit that never appeared in any official handbook. Every morning before opening the primate building, he spent a few silent moments simply watching Koba move through his habitat without interrupting him. Some mornings the silverback climbed. Some mornings he foraged. Other mornings, he simply sat beneath the trees while the first rays of sunlight reached the grass. Nathan no longer believed those quiet moments were time wasted. They reminded him that understanding could not always be measured by commands obeyed or routines completed. Sometimes trust grew strongest in silence. Years later, whenever visitors asked Nathan what the smartest animal he had ever worked with had done, he never began by talking about intelligence. He smiled gently and answered that the wisest lesson he had ever received came from a gorilla who refused to take one more step when everyone else believed the path ahead was perfectly safe. Koba never knew that he had changed training manuals, maintenance procedures, and the way an entire staff viewed the animals in their care. He simply lived each day with the same quiet dignity he always had, unaware that his greatest gift had never been his strength. It had been his patience to keep trying until someone finally understood. The strongest voice is not always the loudest. Sometimes, it is the one we almost fail to hear.